happy days, oh happy days. Restaurants are again open in the state of Florida. Now, it's a far cry from a complete reopening, but it is a step in the right direction. Restaurants are one of the most visual signs of the closure, short of people whose own businesses have been closed and aren't able to go to work. The inability for a lot of people to go to restaurants has been has really changed their lifestyle, because in America, especially since over the last 10 years, the recovery from the last economic crash was sort of in the form of a lot of what certain analysts have called bullshit jobs. And what they mean are sort of these things in the service industry, like restaurants, massive boom in restaurants over the last decade, that has employed a lot of people. They're not necessarily employed in and making as much money as they were before 2008. The jobs that were lost after 2008 paid more than the jobs that were recovered after 2008, if that makes sense. And a part of that, what was able to facilitate this massive boom in restaurants, is that a lot of people just don't know how to cook these days, and they don't cook for themselves. Eating out is it's a staple of a lot of people's lives. Eating out is not the same luxury that it used to be. It's much more routine. And so when that was pulled out from our society, I could tell, even with me, and I'm someone who actually likes to cook, who cooks a lot, who can actually survive without restaurants, who knows how to make food and recipes and things like that. Even I have been feeling sort of a loss from not being able to go to a restaurant. I know it sounds very petty, obviously, since there's been all these terrible economic ramifications for so many people in the country. 30 million people unemployed. Not all of those are people in restaurants, but certainly restaurants and bars make up a huge portion of that, because, like I said, bartenders and waiters, those were the number one jobs created, in the recovery since the last recession in 2008. But a place like a restaurant, of course, for this whole virus thing, is going to be one of the highest risk kind of businesses. And thankfully, our governor here did not just try and tell anyone who's employed in any business anywhere that you have to quit and close your doors tomorrow. It was, fairly limited to businesses that, where this virus is going to spread, like restaurants and bars, and for a time beaches, although the beaches, at least around where I live, are reopened by now. In other states, these shutdowns and lockdowns have been much broader, and have included people in all sorts of industries, and have put plenty more people out of work. So here in Florida, we weren't that badly hit. I mean, if you go out on the roads, throughout this whole event, you never really had the phenomenon to where there were 0 cars on the road, to where you were driving and you didn't see anyone. I never experienced that. Was there less traffic? For a time, yes. I mean, we're getting back to, at this point, it's not terrible traffic, because before all this happened, I was very bothered by the traffic in my area. I thought it was way overcrowded. Certainly has gotten a lot worse in the last few years, and we're not back to that point yet, but the traffic is not light, I would say. And of course, this is anecdotal. I'm basing it off of where I live, and I'm just one person who lives in one town in Florida. But again, these effects are not unrelated to the decisions made by the governor to limit the lockdown, and he's very proud of that. He's made that clear. Our governor, from the beginning, was very resistant to locking anything down, and eventually, when he did do it, he did it begrudgingly, and not to a super, restrictive extent. It was sort of, I don't want to say that it was a lockdown in name only, because it wasn't. It certainly has been enforced, and of course there was that preacher who was arrested for holding services on a Sunday after all of this was issued. And so it's not like, Florida's been free of acts of tyranny, but there's been a very clear demonstration by the governor that, he doesn't want things to be this way. He's not relishing in what's being done, in the same way that Michigan's governor is. He's not talked about, punishing citizens for not wanting to continue with these lockdowns anymore, for questioning him. He hasn't said, maybe that lockdown should get 2 weeks longer just to punish you people, just to teach you a lesson. It's not like that. He's been, much more sympathetic to the folks who don't want to be imprisoned in their own home. And I think that's helped give him credibility amongst people. It's made people, less likely to rebel, because you have to think about it. Who are the people that are the most upset with DeSantis? Who are the people that are criticizing him? Because we hear so much in the media about how, oh my gosh, Florida's governor is making all these controversial decisions. Controversial among whom? Among the people who want the lockdowns to be stricter. Well, if these people want the lockdowns to be stricter, they're staying home on their own anyway. So what he's doing by appeasing the people who don't want it to be as strict is he's not pushing as many people to rebel and go against him. I think that by taking a more nuanced approach, he's been able to massage this issue and not make it feel like that this is some, authoritarian takeover, and that he's forcing people, to do as he says. And so he's trying to be more persuasive. And so, yes, that means that less people, if they don't want, if people want to go out, they're going to be able to go out and potentially get sick. But there's going to be more people, I think, overall, as a percentage of the population, who will willingly comply with this sort of stay-at-home order. And of course, a big thing that people haven't really talked about in Florida is the fact that so many people in this state are retired and don't have to work. These are people who can stay home on their own. The elderly, largely, are able to self-isolate. And the folks I've talked to, who are the most, critical of DeSantis and say, oh my gosh, it's way too early to open things up. We need to stay inside and just be safe. It's like the people I've talked to who are like that are old people who don't have to work. My neighbors, I get along very well with them. They're very worried about things going on right now and reopening up, because, hey, they're older, they're worried about getting sick. But also, they don't have to worry about, making their income. They've already made their money in their life. They're done. They can just sit at home all day if they want. They could stay home all year if they want. Whereas if the governor did everything they wanted, the people who are worried about money, the people who do have to work for a living, they would be rioting in the state capitol just like they are in all these other states. Now, I know that Florida still had its share of protests, but I personally haven't seen or felt the kind of pushback here against the orders that you have seen in other states. And the reason for that is that the government, like I said, has just not been as draconian. I still don't think that it was great. I think that compelling these sorts of orders at all is a bad thing. I think that you're going to create problems by doing it, unintended problems, by forcing people to stay home, such as like I was saying before, putting people out of work and impoverishing them and creating all these other, extraneous problems that are unrelated to people getting sick or staying healthy. But given that every state has put some order like this into place, the way it's been handled here, with a more conciliatory tone, I think has allowed it to succeed. Now, something I was reading an article on CNN.com today, and it was quite funny. I really am amazed sometimes. I try to stay away from CNN, but even I forget just how bad they are and how they frame things and how biased they are against certain political interests. And they wrote this very long news, I believe it was a news article, not an opinion article, talking about just how bad DeSantis is for, trying to be positive in a time like this and reopen things up, and talk about how, not taking such a draconian approach during the lockdowns was a good thing, and how we can start opening up now. And that he was wrong to scold all the models for being wrong, and for saying that Florida was going to have, a situation worse than Italy, and that, the death rates wouldn't be so high, whereas he says that, Florida was able to avoid that by, showing some restraint and in reducing sort of the high-risk situations in which people, could spread this disease en masse, and they were able to slow things down enough to where, we can begin to reopen, and we haven't had this, massive amount of deaths that you've seen in places like Italy or Spain. And so what is CNN's, rebut to his point there, to say that, oh my gosh, you shouldn't be saying this, what you've done is so bad? Well, they cite some epidemiologists, and CNN says that, well, these epidemiologists say that essentially, it was just dumb luck. We have no explanation for why the models were wrong, so we're just going to say you got lucky, and that this was, pure random chance that not a lot of people died. And another thing that they cited is that, oh, well, even without DeSantis saying it, a lot of people are practicing social distancing, and it's, and they're using that and don't realize the irony there in that, well, if people are just doing these things on your own, you don't need a compulsory lockdown. They were kind of scolding, DeSantis and saying, harumph. These people had to practice social distancing without being told to by you. Aren't you ashamed that autonomous individuals acted on their own in their own self-interest? Isn't it terrible that human beings can make decisions for themselves that are responsible? Oh, what a shame. So it really was quite the dishonest hit job. Oh, and of course, did I mention that this reopening is limited to all the counties except 3, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade, which are, of course, the most densely populated parts of the state, which, again, makes sense because, a densely populated place like Miami is going to have a different situation than a place like where I live, to where the population is much less dense. It's the same thing when you look at New York City versus the rest of the country. Well, of course, things are very bad in New York City. People live right on top of each other in New York City. And so just because, people have to be very careful in New York City, we don't have to be as careful in the rest of the country, depending on how, sparsely populated it is. Believe it or not, if you live in rural Wyoming, your chances of getting this disease, it's possible, but it's pretty slim. And so your approach, can't be one size fits all. It can't be the whole country stays inside, for the next 6 months. That's just not going to work. Of course, I've talked about before the societal collapse and economic collapse that would create, but let's leave that aside. Trying to create a one-size-fits-all solution in any sphere for 320 million people across a territory that spans, such a massive, amount of square miles as, the United States is just impossible. And that's why, we have to have different approaches even within Florida. If Florida was an independent country or California or one of these, they'd be a pretty darn big country, okay? Ideally, if Florida was some independent state or whatever, it should probably be a federation at the very least. Same thing with California, New York, or any of these massive U.S. states with such high, millions and millions of people. It doesn't make sense to govern them, even the state itself, as as a single unit with all these one-size-fits-all laws. Now, the only thing that's sort of yet to be determined is the possibility of a second wave coming, and that's something that I've worried about for a while. I was very worried that you have these very strict lockdowns at first, and then things eventually would have to open up because it would slow down the rate of spread, and then there'd probably be another spike. I've been expecting that from the beginning. Now, will there be? I don't know necessarily. It's hard to tell because China, of course, reopened first, and news doesn't come out very well out of China. We know that there are certain places in China that have had to been put back on lockdown again, but I can't keep track of what's going on. So until really, I guess we get data from places outside of China, like the U.S., like where I live in Florida, this whole threat of the second wave, I think, is something that can't really be estimated, because we're certainly far from herd immunity. At least based on what we know. And I think it's still not confirmed if herd immunity is even possible, considering that the confirmed cases of second infections in places like South Korea. We don't know how common or uncommon getting infected with this disease twice is. So there's still a lot up in the air, but given all the uncertainty, I still think that it is a good idea to err on the side of not being a tyrannical overlord like so many of these governors, like Gavin Newsom or this Meg Whitmer or whatever the hell her name is. I don't know if I'm just projecting the name Meg onto her because she kind of seems like a Meg, but I know her name definitely is Whitmer. So anyway, I'm sure I'll follow up with this as soon as I have more information on how this reopening goes, and assuming, when we get into new phases, how each successive phase of reopening goes. And of course, today, on the day that they reopened restaurants, we did get a record number of deaths. So it doesn't, you can't necessarily make the case that Florida has, rounded the bend and is, on the way down in terms of cases. But, remember, the whole purpose of shutting things down to begin with wasn't to stop the disease from spreading. It was to slow it, to stop, the hospitals from being overwhelmed. And, by all accounts, we're far from that. We're far from the hospitals being overwhelmed at this point. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.